Good morning. I'm Gretchen O'Gorman, and I'm going to be the moderator for the first panel. I'm pleased to introduce our first speaker, Francis Galan. He is an associate professor of history at Texas A&M University, San Antonio, where he teaches courses on Latin America, Mexico, Texas, and the Caribbean. He received his PhD in history from Southern Methodist University, his master's in history from UTSA, and his BA in Latin American Studies from UT Austin. His book, Los Tejas, I hope I named that right, The First Capital of Spanish Texas, was published in 2020 by Texas A&M University Press, College Station, through the Summerfield G. Roberts Texas History Series. This work received a 2023 Book Award from the San Antonio Conservation Society Foundation, a 2022 Book Award from the Texas Old Missions and Forts Restoration Association, and was a finalist for the 2021 Ramirez Family Award for Most Significant Scholarly Book from the Texas Institute of Letters. He is from San Antonio, and together with his wife, Dr. Emma Mata Galan, they have 2 children. So let's welcome Dr. Galan.
Good morning, everybody. It's wonderful to be here. Just what will turn out to be probably a pretty hot day later on, but it's always nice and cool in here. I am honored to be here before you, and just want to thank the wonderful folks from the Witty. Maurice McDermott's just great, and Mary Margaret, everybody. In the first chapter of my book about Los Tejas, where I discuss the transformation of East Texas into the borderlands during the early 18th century, I mentioned Franciscans reported that a Caddo woman named Angelina, who was Hispanicized at Mission San Juan Bautista de Rio Grande, near present Eagle Pass, north of Laredo, also acted as a guide and interpreter for the Ramon expedition to East Texas in 1716. This was, in fact, the first of several Spanish references to this rather mysterious woman whom the Frenchman André Pinacao had mentioned earlier in his account of meeting a Hasinai Indian named Angelique sometime between 1712 and 1714, while on a journey with Louis Jougerot de Saint-Denis, a third-generation French-Canadian adventurer who established a trade post at Natchitoches in northwestern Louisiana. Saint-Denis also had served as guide for the Ramon expedition long after the first attempt at Spanish conquest in the land of the Tejas failed miserably in 1693 following the search for La Salle's colony. 2 French sources described her as an angelic being who spoke Spanish and served as intermediary between Europeans and Indians. A young French military officer named François Simars de Balal lived with Angelique for more than 2 months and survived the winter of 1721. Balal had left La Rochelle, France in August 1719 for the French colony of Louisiana, but the captain became lost at sea, and his ship ran aground near the mouth of Galveston Bay, where Balal and 4 of his companions wandered about until fatigue and starvation overtook them. Balal was the last survivor when taken captive by members of the Atacapan tribe known as Acoquisa or Coquisac Indians. Hasinai warriors freed Balal from captivity and took him to their village located several days away in late November or December 1720, where he met an Indian woman named Angelica and learned that she had lived with the Spaniards since her childhood. Balal recorded in his account that she served me all the best she had, and she had as much love for me as if I had been her child. I found this treatment so sweet when compared to what I had received previously that in less than 8 days I was cured from my ills. After expressing his desire to return to his country, Angelica assembled 3 horses, enough food for a long journey, and offered 2 of her children to accompany Balal as guides to Natchitoches, Louisiana, where they arrived safely. Just who exactly was this woman the French and Spanish relied upon in Texas during the early 18th century, when the Camino Real was blazed eastward from New Spain or colonial Mexico? Whether known as Angelique, Angelina, or Angelica, she was an important figure whom, like women in general, are largely hidden in the conquest of Texas and the violence that occurred among men from different cultural backgrounds. In a great article titled Finding Angelina, The Search for East Texas's Little Angel, Emily Hyatt and Jonathan Galan from the History Center in Diboll, Texas, south of Lufkin, consider whether Angelique really was the East Texas equivalent of a Pocahontas or Sacagawea. Meanwhile, from a Spanish-Mexican perspective, since Texas under Spain was an extension of the northward movement of missions, presidios, towns, and ranches from central Mexico, I can't help but wonder how Angelique fits with the famous Doña Marina, also known as in Mexico La Malinche, who served as interpreter for Hernán Cortés in his quest to conquer the Aztecs, and with whom she gave birth to the first mestizo, or mixed Spanish-Indian child of Mexico. The Chicana poet Teresa Palomo Acosta, together with scholar Ruth Weingarten, note in their book, Las Tejanas, 300 Years of History, that Angelina is one of the first indigenous women to whom Tejanos are bound historically and culturally. Maybe Angelique is the true mother of Texas. After all, she was an Hasinai, Tejas Indian woman. Regardless of perspective, Hyatt and Galan are correct in stating that learning about the mystery of Angelina is a way to honor this real-life historical figure and remind modern East Texans of the many forces and nationalities that shape the area we call home. Indeed, any nationalities of Texas must begin with indigenous peoples and the natural environments where they lived and nourished cultural survival. According to historian David Levere, by the late 17th century, the Hasinai Caddos of East Texas were composed of 10 city-states and commonly referred to as the Tejas by the Humanos of West Texas, who were engaged in long-distance trade with the Caddos, as well as by the Spanish, who believed the term Tejas referred to the friendly disposition of the Caddos. The anthropologist Hiram P. Gregory, whose work focused on the archaeological site of Los Adayas, explains that Hasinai is a Caddoan term which translates as the people, and that there's a great deal of confusion about who was and who was not Caddoan. According to elderly Caddos residing at Anadarko, Oklahoma in the mid-20th century, tribal names were merely geographic place names in many cases. The Caddoan locative prefix na can be seen to precede many of the tribal names in East Texas, such as Nadaco, Nabadachi, Nacogdoches, and Nakono. The term Nadai refers to someone specifically from the Adai place, while some endings of tribal names suggest foods like pawpaw, hickory, or other plants, while still others sound like kin terms. In other words, na acts in a way like the Spanish prefix de la, of the, where someone is from or who are the parents, and perhaps like the Arabic prefix al in surnames of people like Aleman or Alvarado or Andalus, denoting the Iberian Peninsula and Moorish origin. Names and linguistics aside, the Caddos formed the westernmost part of the Mississippian cultural tradition dating back thousands of years, known most notably for their temple and burial mounds. They were primarily agricultural societies mixed with hunting and fishing. Several generations of families lived in large thatch domed roofs. They were mostly matrilineal and matrilocal. They carved their own niche with the ability to control the crossroads of major trails, positioned as such in East Texas, where the southwestern woodlands met the western prairies and Great Plains, which Levere explains allowed them to tap into exchange networks across the continent. Demographically, between 700 and 1550, there were as many as 250,000 people who lived in Caddo towns, villages, and hamlets that dotted the region between the Arkansas and Red, Sabine, Angelina, and Trinity rivers. Between the arrival of De Soto Moscoso expedition in the mid-16th century and the arrival of Ramon expedition in 1716, the Caddos experienced drastic declines in their population. In 1691, just 1 year after the arrival of the Spanish in East Texas under the Alonso de Leon and Father Damien Massanet expedition, approximately 3,000 Caddos died from smallpox. Levere notes how the Caddos were hit again with smallpox in 1718, 1759, and 1777, such that ethnogenesis or what scholars refer to as ethnic rebirth, became one strategy for all Indians dealing with disease, depopulation, raids, and the constant need for horses, buffalo, and manufactured goods. Other strategies included inviting the Spanish to set up missions, adopting French traders, and straight-up trade through diplomatic gifts from the Spanish and French, in addition to their own diplomacy with other indigenous nations. By the late 18th century, only 4 of the original 10 city-states of the Hasinai Caddo survived: the Hasinai or Tejas, the Nadako or Anadarko, the Nabadachi, and the Nacogdoches. Altogether, maybe 8,000 to 12,000 Caddos remained in the entire region of the Texas-Louisiana borderlands. By the mid-19th century, only the Tejas and Anadarko remained, and they would join with the Cadodachos, the only remaining community of the 4, at the Great Bend of the Red River, to constitute the Caddos and part of what the U.S. designated as Indian Territory and eventually the state of Oklahoma by 1907. Most interesting for this presentation, as Levere notes, is that the Cadai, or principal chief, and possibly even the Zinesis, or priest chief, did not always have to be male. For example, the Spanish missionary Gaspar Solis, who visited the Hasinai chiefdom's Nabadachi community in the mid-18th century, reported, "There is an Indian woman of great authority and following whom they call Santa Adiva, which means great lady or principal lady. Her house was very large, with many rooms, and she had many Indian men and women as servants." Solis added that she is married to 5 Indian men. In short, she is like a queen among them. Evidently, Caddos were not the only Mississippian peoples in the Southeast who had female chiefs as well. In the case of colonial Mexico, there were both caciques and cacicas in the segregated República de Indios, or self-governing Indian communities. Interestingly, historian Juliana Barr notes how the Spanish were unaware in early meetings of the Caddos symbolic association of women with peace. One Hasinai creation myth, recorded by Franciscans in the early 1690s, told of a woman in heaven who daily gave birth to the sun, moon, water, frost, snow, corn, thunder, and lightning. Another Caddo oral tradition, reported in 1763, told of a female goddess named Sacado, who appeared to their ancestors to teach them how to survive in the world, and then disappeared once they learned how to hunt, fish, build homes, and dress. This is perhaps why, Barr notes, that the image of the Virgin Mary held even more crucial significance for initial Spanish-Caddo exchanges, which the Caddo did not associate with the French. Who knows, but maybe our Angelique of East Texas, besides being a scout and interpreter, also became a chief, if not a queen. Either way, the anthropologist Gregory argues that rather than a dominant, subordinate European Indian acculturation, there were relations in the Caddo world that approached true symbiosis, where at this point, the Caddo are seen as contributors to, not merely recipients from cross-cultural exchange. Indeed, trade relationships were essentially based on kinship across cultural groups, which I discuss in my own work, as Catholicism provided a means for the French and Spanish to establish real and fictive ties with each other and with Indians as well as Africans, whether by force or persuasion, through the practice of compadrazgo, or co-parenthood. However, the Caddos made their own kinship connections, as they had done for centuries, except now with Europeans, and so Catholicism offered another opportunity for trade, even though they largely did not convert to Christianity, at least in the 18th century. Economically, the deer hide trade took off in the region around 1740, while fabrics began to appear in the account books of soldiers from Los Adayas with ells of Limburg, shirts, and blankets. Among the material culture recovered from the fort after ceramics and trade beads were glass, much of it derived from Mexico, with smaller amounts of wine bottles resulting from French trade connections, as well as metal objects, including iron, brass, copper, lead, silver, pewter, and gold plate. Besides nails, which were most numerous, 28 other categories of artifacts were found: iron pan, 12 knives, both butcher and clap, 2 Jews' harps, 4 buckles, kettles, coin, gun parts, rings, buttons, etc. besides a few artifacts made of stone, as well as a peculiar bead of black jet, not glass, that was found at the Los Adayas site, roughly barrel-shaped with a single incised line carved around the orifice on each end, which were interpreted as rosary beads, similar to the rosary beads found at Mission San Jose in San Antonio. Gregory explains the objects suggest cultural activities of culinary, writing, sewing, agricultural, military, personal adornment, and recreation. Scissors and needle in particular suggest the activity of female domesticity. However, as we learned from more recent scholars, like my own colleague, Dr. Amy Porter, Hispanic women were also ranchers, so that they held roles both within and outside the home. While my book focused on the crucial intercultural marriage in 1716 between Saint Denis and Manuela Sanchez Navarro, who was the grandniece of Captain Ramon, the local commandant at Presidio San Juan Bautista on the Rio Grande, near the mission of the same name, I was left with more questions than answers about Angelique and the transformation of the frontier in East Texas and its messy borders, because Angelique disappears from the historical record in 1721. In that year, according to the diary of the Franciscan Juan Antonio de la Peña, who was chaplain of the Aguayo expedition, which was the last stop in Spain's third attempt at conquest of East Texas, she acted as interpreter between the Hasinai Tejas chief and the Marqués de Aguayo. While we know that Manuela and Saint Denis had 5 children, 2 of them born at San Juan Bautista before she traveled to Natchitoches, where she gave birth to 3 more children, we don't know how many children Angelique had or who was their father or fathers. Certainly, Manuela and other Spanish women acted as cultural brokers and, as Dr. Porter explains, likely wielded more power than meets the eye. Angelique may rightly be seen in a similar light, but we just don't know whom she married, if at all, or what happened to her after 1721. We know she sent a couple of her children with the Frenchman Belial to help him arrive at Natchitoches, so we can guess that she was older than Manuela, since the children would have been teenagers, if not young adults, to have acted as guides themselves. We know from Franciscan missionaries that Angelique also served on the Alarcón expedition that founded Mission San Antonio de Valero, which continued to East Texas for resupply of missions there, and that Angelique served in the Aguayo expedition in 1721 that reestablished the missions in East Texas, along with the Presidios Tejas and Los Adayas. It's possible that Angelique also knew of Saint Denis and Manuela. However, Manuela did not travel with Saint Denis on the earlier Ramon expedition in 1716, presumably because she was pregnant and with a small babe in her arms. It seems quite logical then that after Manuela met up with her husband in Natchitoches around 1721, that her power grew along with the wealth of Saint Denis, who not only founded the French fort of Natchitoches, but also served a long time as its commandant. Whether Angelique's power and influence continued to rise, we can only speculate, but we can imagine that Manuela complemented, if not eclipsed, Angelique's presence among the French. It's also quite possible that Angelique succumbed to diseases that ravaged indigenous peoples everywhere, but we just don't know for certain that she died in 1721 or soon thereafter. Despite being in the shadows of the men surrounding her, Angelique has been immortalized of sorts with the recent statue of her, as well as a historical marker in East Texas, showing her bridging the gap between Spanish missionaries and Indians so that both sides can communicate with each other and hopefully live in peace. I also have to read in between the lines of many archival records that indicate Spanish trade with the Indians and French through the soldiers also acting as intermediaries along with muleteers. In this slide, we can see various so-called Indios Bárbaros, or savage Indians, in East Texas because they presumably were not Christians, who were included, listed in there, the Tejas, San Pedro, Nazones, and Badai. And not all of these were associated with the Hasinai-Caddo Confederacy, if you will. As well as Orcoquisas from the lower Trinity River, receiving from Governor Don Jacinto de Barrios y Guaragui 2 arrobas, or 50 pounds of gunpowder, 200 pounds of ammo, knives, razors, combs, vermilion, and other goods through his soldiers, and the remaining goods, including around 1,100 hides, to Natchitoches. Women likely prepared these hides, if not involved in the actual transport of goods. In this slide, an original settler of Los Odayas, Pedro de Sierra, testified that horses, maize, and hides were traded from Mission Nacogdoches through the governor's muleteer, Juan Antonio Maldonado, together with Sergeant Domingo Chirino, to Saltillo, to the neighboring province of Coahuila. Interestingly, the use of the Spanish word trafique, or commerce, as both noun and verb, is a term in modern English normally associated with drug, gun, or human trafficking. Sierra and other officers, plus many rank-and-file soldiers, were married, and whose spouses would have taken care of the home or rancho in the absence of their husbands or other related kin. Because of Spain's mercantile economy and its monopoly over virtually all trade in colonial Mexico, there's no surprise that many contraband trails emerged in East Texas during the 18th century, most of which benefited from long-established indigenous knowledge and control of trade routes, such as the one pictured here along the Badice Trail in the lower Trinity River. I cannot help but venture to guess that women were also involved in contraband trade and not solely as captives sold into slavery. I also imagine the roles of other women, however, such as the house of the curandera, or folk healer, shown in this bird's eye view of Los Odayas sketched in 1767, women who likely acted as midwives. What were their own backgrounds, since most of the people were impoverished and who perhaps aspired to be like Angelique or Manuela as their role models? Land, trade, and freedom later attracted more French, Italian, Irish, Anglo, African-American, and Southeastern Indian families to settle in East Texas from the 1790s through the Texas Revolution in 1835-1836. Angelina County, where the Burris family first settled around 1820, was organized in 1846, just after statehood, and the only one out of 254 counties in Texas named after a woman. Trade, especially in tobacco, cotton, cattle, lumber, oil, and gas, became part of the entire fabric of life in East Texas, though women largely remained hidden figures in its history. Interestingly, in Lufkin, which is the county seat and largest town in Angelina County, there's a mural located on the back of the Lufkin ISD administration building on Cotton Square that is Lance Hunter's work from the year 2000 titled Laying the Tracks, which celebrates the 100th anniversary of the Angelina and Neches River Railroad, with an Angelina-like figure shining a light ahead of Angelina Lumber Company's Engine 110. This image, evidently influenced by the John Gast 1872 painting of American settlers moving westward, symbolic of progress and manifest destiny, with an angelic-like lady leading the way while carrying a book as the standard bearer above. And she's not presented as Native American or the Virgin Mary, though certainly providential. Angelique, and women's history generally, at least, provides us with a more balanced, if not nuanced, view of the past that challenges us to reconsider traditional views about our origins in Texas and from which direction we all derived. Thank you.
Now it's time for our question and answer session. How do I turn this microphone on? It's on already? Okay. Oh, it's after the next one. Oh, okay. Sorry. Oh, never mind. We're just going to go to the next speaker. Our next speaker is Bradford Bame. And he is a San Antonio firefighter, a Medina County rancher, and hay farmer in his family farm in Castroville, and is happily married to a fellow sixth-generation German Alsatian Texan. They are raising their 3 children on the farm to appreciate and participate in the traditions and culture of their forebears. So let's give it a round of applause to Mr. Bain. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for having me to the Whitty Museum and Huth Coates Foundation. Of course, there's some information about the Huth family in my presentation, and to my good buddy Phil King for conning me into doing this in his stead. Connie Bamos is a late good friend of mine. She was a historian in Castroville, and she one time in an interview called the people of Castroville pretentious. And I wondered what that meant, so I looked it up. And it means that you put on more culture than you actually have. But I never agreed with her on that after I found out what pretentious meant, because we have a lot of culture out there. It's a simple culture, but it's a long, neat history, Alsatian history, Texas history. You know, the fact that folks came from Europe and the crowded cities or the little villages, and then all of a sudden became pistol-toting, horseback riding, Indian fighting Texans, I just think is incredible, and it's something that I'm very proud of, that I belong to that kind of history. I wanted to give a presentation on Louis Huth and Henri Castro. They're the founders of Castroville, and then it's basically their history and their involvement out there, and then my thoughts as a descendant of a colonist on their actions. Here's a nice photograph of Henri Castro when he was a young man, optimistic. And it just so happens that in our little museum out there in Castroville, we have some recorded audio of him, if you'd like to go see it. And if it'll play, will it play? Yeah? You can listen to his thoughts on the colony.
Bonjour et bienvenue à my village. In the early 1840s, Texas needed people, and in Europe we had too many. So I wrote this advertisement in French and in German, inviting these European colonists to Texas. I set up the headquarters of my Société de Colonisation in Paris. I talked with the people from Alsace, from Belfort, Belgium, from Germany. It was a huge task, but I am fortunately so constituted that obstacles called forth my firmness and power of resistance. We, these young people, these young, courageous people who heard about this free land in the Americas set sail from ports like Le Havre, Antwerp, and Bremen to arrive 2 months later in Galveston or New Orleans. Then they continued their journey by foot, by horseback, boat, cart, by wagon, by any means of conveyance they could find, eventually to reach this promised land. 5 years into the venture, 27 ships had carried about 2,000 of my colonists to Texas. It was hard, very hard. Certainly it was not easy. There were many dissenters. What's next? I told them, in order to enjoy the resources which have been offered to us, what are we supposed to do? Work with fortitude and perseverance and in unity. Therefore, let us get down to the task at hand without hesitation and especially without losing any time. I had promised a land of milk and honey, and those who worked the hardest achieved it. It is their descendants who are here today. I am so glad you have come. Bienvenue. Join us. Si ça vous plaît.
Pretty good footage for over 200-year-old footage, right? I like his accent. It's kind of a mix of a young Texan and a French accent, right? So, like I said, if you want to come out to Castroville sometime, we have a little museum out there. It's the Castro Colonies Heritage Association's Living History Museum, and it's housed in the Beery's home in Castroville. It's open on Saturday and Sunday, but we're just volunteers, the folks that docent there. So, and then we also had a footage found in an old trunk, in an attic of Henri Castro, a little bit older, and more dejected, of course, by his experience in trying to colonize in Texas, out in Comanche, all the little things that the Republic of Texas left out of their information that they gave him. Can you play it? Oop, it went to the next slide. Oh. This is very handy having IT guys. I would really, really, really be. If it doesn't work, it's okay. It's trying to. See, this is some of that old footage, so you have problems with it sometimes. There it is.
My French colony, or Texas, have not come to be as I expected. But what does? No reason to abandon this great venture. It is my destiny to secure the welfare of these families. And with fortitude, perseverance, and unity, these colonies will succeed. Over 20 years, I have dedicated my life to acquiring resources and loans for this endeavor and for these good people. Many long for life in the old country, forgetting that it was just as arduous. Farmers in easy circumstance rarely immigrate, and those that came to this great place came with the promise of land and security, something to leave their children and their children's children. Countless opportunities are open to them here that they could never have dreamed of in Europe. Despite the obstacles we have faced, I am confident that a bright future is still in reach. The Comanche raids are fewer every year, and as the colonies develop, there continue to be new resources for these families. Castroville has now become a stagecoach station on the road to San Diego, California, opening up the wide expanses of this country for all who would explore it. And yet, some colonists have threatened my life, as though I were not fighting for them each and every day. Max nix, as my Alsatian friends say. I shall remain steadfast as we see greater successes with each passing year. As I have often confided in the admirable Sam Houston, I have devoted my life to the cause of Texas. This is no longer a question of profit, but a point of honor.
How about that? You recognize that guy, besides it possibly being Henri Castro from a few hundred years ago? That's me. Yeah, Toxie McMillan is a group or a firm here in San Antonio, and they helped us put together our displays out there at the museum to give it a nice professional flair. And they videoed myself and my cousin doing Henri Castro. So Tyler Graff and I, we're firemen in San Antonio together, but we both live and farm out there. He lives in Hondo, Quiggy, and I live out in Castroville. And I asked him one day, I said, hey, you want to do something fun? And he likes history like me. I said, they're going to film us, and we're going to pretend to be Henri Castro. And we did. And that, I took one semester of French at UTSA before I graduated, and I thought, yeah, I could do a French accent. Did I pull it off? Yeah? That thing plays all the time. As soon as you walk in the museum, it plays, and I'm like, oh, God, I got to listen to these guys again. But It was fun, and it turned out really good. So, y'all, does everyone know where Castroville is? It's just west of town. And of course, in 1844, just west of town was a very dangerous place. It's not that there wasn't folks out there. There were folks out there. It was a dangerous place if you wanted to go out and set up a farm or something like that. But Henri Castro, he was from France, and he found himself in Texas in 1842, during the Republic, of course. And he was working for a bank in France, the Lafitte banking firm. And Texas, of course, was broke, and they needed money, so they were going to go get a loan, just like anybody else, right? And Henri Castro was there to try to help secure that loan for them. It didn't work out. You know, I think they tried with a lot of banks in Europe, and it didn't work out anywhere. But they knew they had lots of land, right? Spain had tried this impresario system, is what they called it, someone to engage in an enterprise, impresario. And so Castro was friends with Anson Jones and Sam Houston, folks like that up there, and he got himself a contract. They made it so that the impresario could get half of the land that was given to the colonists back as his payment for his undertaking. So that was the idea. Going to get rich off of land. It's a good idea. Land goes up in value. It just didn't back then real fast. He first recruited out of Paris, so he got a lot of folks from around Paris. He got a lot of folks from, where was the Pigeonots were from? Milly Meuse. Meuse is a department in France, like Alsace is, like Bordeaux, you know, those kinds of places. They're nearer to Paris. That's where he had luck in recruiting at first. And he sent 3 ships to Texas loaded with those folks. And those folks' names are real French-sounding names. They're on the founder's plaque, but they're no longer around Castroville. In 1843, he met father and son. There's a few sources that say he met Ludwig, the dad, first, and there's a few sources that say he met Louis, the son, first. But somehow they got to know each other, and Henri Castro was a smooth talker. And he convinced everyone he talked to that you can move to Texas, and in about a month or 2, you're going to get rich, and then you can come on back home. And so the Huths bought it hook, line, and sinker, just like everyone else. Not anything to be nervous about. Texas was the opportunity. That was what Castro was selling, and that's what they were buying. So Ludwig Huth, whose wife Catherine was Alsatian, and you'll hear me say Alsatian a lot, and people always say, "What is Alsatian? What is that?" But it's just where the folks that he ended up recruiting came from. It's a department in France. It's right on the Rhine River. It's just like Texas. It's a blend of cultures because it's on the frontier. And so you've got names like Pierre Hoffenbraffen, you know, French and German. So Ludwig was a wine merchant, and he had an insurance business. He was a big-time mover and shaker in Neufreistadt, Baden, Germany. It's right across the Rhine from Alsace. So Ludwig Huth, the father, and Castro, Henri Castro, they made a deal for the company to sell European goods in Texas and then return to France or to Germany with cotton and cattle hides, that kind of stuff. And so it'd be like a deadheading a truck, a shipment, you know, going one direction and then coming back empty. Well, that's not very profitable. So they thought, hey, we'll put stuff on it and we'll make it a two-way trip. It's a good idea. And then in addition, Ludwig's son Louis would go to Castroville wasn't in existence yet, but to Texas, to San Antonio, and then he would oversee this colonization effort that Henri Castro was going to be engaged in, and look after their trading business. So Louis sailed on the John Key in October of 1843. It was the 4th ship that Castro sent. He sent somewhere around like 27 ships altogether. And also on board was Jules Simon Bourgeois. He's a Frenchman. He was in Napoleon's army. He was actually hired by Auguste Fertilier's mom to escort Auguste to Texas because she was afraid for her son. And Auguste Fertilier was eventually Theodore Gentile's son-in-law. Theodore Gentile's was a really interesting man. He was a very famous artist, and there's some of his art still around. see here. So Lewis, when he arrived at Galveston, they landed in Galveston and they got on a steamship and got down to Indianola because it's a shorter walk from Indianola to San Antonio than it is from Galveston over to San Antonio. Well, he found all these folks there kind of, upset with Henri Castro. I'll use stronger words, but they were, like Henri Castro, the video there, he says, there were some people that threatened his life, and they were upset, they had felt that they were conned into coming to Texas and then left here on this beach and, getting fevers, and it was terrible. And then, of course, there was no land of milk and honey. It was, hey, I don't know where we're going to send you. Y'all just hang out here till Castro gets here. So Lewis Huth undertook the efforts himself with his own money to get those people off the coast and up to San Antonio at least. And so finally, after a rough start with the help of Lewis Huth, Henri Castro's organization got organized. He had Ludwig Huth in Europe recruiting, getting out into the villages and saying, hey, come to Texas, free land. And then he had Lewis there in Texas to actually kind of organize things as is on the boots on the ground. There's two historical markers we have on each of those individuals, Henri Castro and Lewis Huth. This names of folks gets confusing. I'm sure y'all know this if you do some genealogy. They thumb through one page of the Bible. Let's use Jacob. Let's use Lewis, so everyone's named the same. So Castro was able to return to Texas in 1844, and finally by September 3rd, he made this initial trek out to Castroville to basically build Castroville. And he was in the company of some of Jack Hayes' Texas Rangers. He knew Jack Hayes personally, which I think is super cool. And 27 colonist men. There was a couple of my great-great-great-grandpas in that group of 27 men. And some cart drivers, some Mexican guys from San Antonio that they were hired to drive the carts. And in Castro's diary, it's the steady hand in Lewis Huth. They were fond of each other at that time. They were reckon on me as I reckon on you. That's what Henri Castro wrote in a bunch of his letters to Lewis Huth. I thought, man, that's strong wording, trust, but like way more than trust, reckon. There's a reckoning. And so they were actually able to take those eager colonists out there to get them started on carving their homes out of the wilderness. Here's the folks that are on the founder's plaque there in September Square. It's a little square we have. It's kind of where they camped out when they first got to Castroville. And you'll see, oh cool, I get to use a laser. Theodore Gentile's there, Auguste Fertilier, Jules Simon Bourgeois, Lewis Huth, George Couples, he was a doctor. There's some famous names that made their way to San Antonio. And then there's Joseph Havey. There's Charles D. Montel, Texas Ranger, steamship captain in the Civil War, really neat guy. Nicholas Havey, Jacob Havey, that's one of my great-great-great-grandpas. And then there's John Ulrich Zürcher. He's one of my great-great-great-grandpas. And then a lot of other folks that disappeared into history, that didn't stay very long, that tried to realize this pitch that Castro had sold them on getting rich quick. Well, they didn't get rich quick, and they said, well, we're going back to Europe, and a lot of them did, so they're not still around. But, if you've ever driven through Castroville, you maybe stop and get some donuts there at Havey's, right? You know what Havey's is. Havey's were magnanimous. They were prolific, to say the least. My great-grandpa was one of 17 kids, so that's why there's a bunch of them. But they called him the Hoggy Shoggy. Hoggy Shoggy, that's Alsatian, and I probably shouldn't say what it actually means. Mach Snicks, that's what I say in that. Did you hear me say that in the video? Mach Snicks, it's the same as in German. It matters not. Mach Snicks. My grandpa always said that. Mach Snicks. These are Bishop Bowden here on the left and Father Claude Dubuis on the right. And Father Dubuis became the bishop of Texas also later in his career. And I think it's really neat that bishop came. Well, Castro knew this was important too, so he had the bishop come out, and they laid the cornerstone to our little first rendition of St. Louis Catholic Church like 9 days after they started building the town. And little tiny affair. It's still there. It's a really cool little chapel. And then, of course, we built up a really nice cathedral in 1868. And I was baptized there and married there, and so have all the previous generations of my family there in Castroville. We started out Lutheran, and then we became Catholic, because one of my great-great-great-grandpa Bames married a Haby. They're Catholic, French. And the daddy was out in the field, and the mama took the kids to school and to church, and well, then their kids became Catholic. And I was riding around with a good friend of mine, retired fire lieutenant, Anthony Stinson, and he's Lutheran. And he said, I was telling him the story, the Bames, they used to be Lutheran. He said, yeah, what happened? Well, they married these Habies, these Catholics, and they all became Catholic. And yeah, okay. He said, well, it's not too late to return to the faith. He said, he's trying to recruit me back to the Lutheran faith. It's not too much difference. I've been to a Lutheran Mass. It's the same thing, basically. So Louis Huth and Jules Simon Bourgeois, these guys were buddies. They came over on the ship together. They're learning how to become Texans. Louis Huth made a mistake. He was first thing they killed when they were down there on the beach. They killed what they thought was a turkey, and they were cooking it up. They were going to eat it for supper. They had each bought shotguns and guns in Belgium. And then somebody came along, and they're like, what do you got there? And they said, oh, we killed a turkey. And they're like, that's not a turkey, that's a buzzard. They were going to eat that buzzard. Could you imagine? Ugh. So those two guys, they were elected the first justice of the peace in Castroville. And Castroville at the time was in Bexar County. Bexar County was like went up to Colorado. It's huge. And they cut Medina County out of Bexar County in 1848. So Castro then appointed Louis Huth as the director of the colony, and Castro went back to Europe after only being there for 2 months. He got them started. They built a little jacal, little hut, grass roof, thatched bare grass from off the river, and all the guys, they lived in there while they were starting out building their little. Basically, I'd like to do a study on it, but it's called Casa Fuertes. They borrowed it from the Mexican families here in San Antonio, and it's just a block house with little windows and stuff. I have one in my backyard, and I have a few pictures of it. I'll show y'all in a little bit. But he left them in Louis Huth's hands, literally just said, all right, reckon on me as I reckon on you. See you later. And Louis was instrumental in convincing a lot of folks that were disgruntled that had came to Texas under contract, but didn't come out to Castroville. He was responsible for getting a lot of them out there. And so everyone that he did convince to come to Castroville meant another 320 acres for Henri Castro's, accumulation of land. And at the same time, Prince Solms and his men were recruiting in San Antonio, trying to go get people to come to New Braunfels, to go to New Braunfels. And so since they were already in Texas, it was pretty easy pickings, So they had to fight back and forth, and these people had to make decisions on top of decisions, and it was just a confusing time. It always, that I guess any time is a confusing time, but that certainly was a confusing time for them. Unfortunately, Huth was so busy, tending to the myriad of details in getting a village started on the frontier of Texas that he didn't pay much attention to their trade deal down there, and this Martin and Cobb mercantile misappropriated funds, and the Huth family lost out kind of big. Hope there's no Martin or Cobb descendants here. That's always sticky with history, right? Like, I got to tell you this, but it might make you mad. But there's a lot of neat letters in the Briscoe collection. I guess the Huth family gave all these papers to the Briscoe Center in Austin, and you can read them, and it's really fun reading them. A lot of them are in French. I can read French fairly well. I can read Spanish well, but there's not a lot of Spanish. And then there's a lot in German. And actually, the Huths communicate with one another in French, even though they lived in Germany, which makes sense since the mama was Alsatian, she was French, and those people, they speak multiple languages. So anyways, this Martin and Cobb, they flubbed up the deal. And then Albert Huth, this is Lewis's younger brother, became the commissioner of the colony effort, and he tried to manage both the colony's payroll and the Huth's trading business there. But he didn't fare too well either. It was just too much for them guys to handle. It was a lot of paperwork, and a lot of letters got lost in the mail, and it took forever for the letters to get around too. Sorry, I didn't tell you who this guy is. This one here, this is neat. This is on the Texas History Association webpage as Lewis Huth. So this is part of the stuff about confusing names. Well, Lewis Huth had a brother named Albert Huth, right? That was the commissioner. This is Albert Huth, and he was in the Turner Hook and Ladder Company. It was the precursor to the San Antonio Fire Department. It started in 1869, and it ended in 1891, which is the year that San Antonio Fire Department started. And he's got, that's ceremonial hat. He ain't going to wear that into a fire, but what they wear into a fire ain't much more than that. They were real firemen. They tucked those whiskers of that mustache in their mouth and used that as their breathing apparatus. Can you imagine? But I thought, that guy's too young to be Lewis Huth. And so I called the museum down there, San Antonio Fire Museum, and I talked with Hector, and he said, yeah, I recognize him. That's Albert Huth. And so I'll show you some pictures later where I'm tying myself into these guys. I like to emulate people from the past because they were cool. They were great. I'll show you his brother and the Hook and Ladder Company, a few pictures that Hector sent me. And so I guess they have it wrong on their webpage, but that's not uncommon because I think Lewis Huth's full name was like Louis August Huth. Oh, sorry. I better hustle. Okay. Gentiles. Okay, so Castro's financial woes caught up with them, and so he had to find some investors in Antwerp. William de Hennis was a banker and headed up this group that invested with him. And then the Huth Company invested in that endeavor. In 1846, March of 1846, Louis Huth, Charles D. Montel as surveyor, and Theodore Gentiles as the engineer established the second village in Castro colony, Quihi. We have a nice dance hall there if you ever want to come out. September of 1846, Jules Simon Bourgeois established the third village in Vandenberg. And then in February of 1847, Theodore Gentiles established the fourth and final village in Dehennis. And that's where my wife's from, in Dehennis. That's Gentiles there, self-portrait. There's Huth as an older man, Henri Castro, an older man. By 1846, Castro owed Ludwig a bunch of money. Castro also had, bilked Louis Huth out of some money. And finally, in November 1846, Castro removed Louis Huth from his position as the head of the colony. Julia Notwell wrote a book on Henri Castro, and she said, he may not have been an honest man, but he was a gentleman. So in 1847, Henri Castro's impresario contract ended, so no one else could come. He brought over 2,000 people to Texas. And through the 1850s, he lost control over the colonists. He became fairly unpopular. He lost his fortune. His fortune was going to be in land. He had 52,500 acres that sold for 7 cents an acre in a sheriff's cell. And he wrote the check to Elise, who he owed money to. And so the Huth family and the Castro family lost out greatly on Henri Castro's failure to capitalize. Henri Castro died in Monterrey, Mexico, September 3rd, 1865. And Louis Huth, he remained popular there in Castroville. He was elected tax assessor 1848, the county clerk 1850 to 1858, chief justice, or actually the judge of Medina County for a term, 1860 to 62. And with George Hass, he had a store in the latter 1840s, and he also had a brewery and a grist mill. Beer was important in Castroville then, just as it is today. Louis Huth was first married to Rosalie Reen. She was an Alsatian girl, and she died, and their second son, they had cholera really bad, 1849, in Castroville. And then he married Sophie Kunin, and the family moved to San Antonio in 1863, where they ran a successful hardware, farm, implement, and seed store. Louis Huth died in San Antonio December 24th, 1892. Sorry, I'm speeding up a whole bunch. She said, 5 minutes. I thought, okay, this is like when my wife calls me home from the field. I said, yeah, I'll be there in 5 minutes. Louis Huth's home in Castroville, still there, neat place. 6 degrees of separation between the colonists and the founders of the colony. Not even close, right? Back then, everybody knew each other. And in a small town, even to this day, everybody knows each other. That's my great-great-great-grandpa, Dr. Frederick August Boehm. He went to University of Leipzig and got his jurisprudence there. And he knew it and interacted with Henri Castro and Louis Huth on a personal level, personal basis. Louis Huth was the county clerk in Medina County, and he issued and signed their marriage certificate in 1852. There's his Louis Huth right there, signature. And he also handled and distributed Elizabeth's fortune at $2,000 from her deceased husband, George Wagner. There's his signature right there, Louis Huth, Medina County clerk. Those are neat old pictures we have actually from a trunk in an attic kind of thing. The Boehm started out in this little log cabin. This picture was taken in the 30s. It's on UT's photo archive page. And Dr. Boehm had bought 1,500 acres up there for $1,100. Pretty good deal. And but they prospered, and the family grew. They were involved. We're still involved in stock raising, farming, land speculation, if you will. We kind of buy land at $1 an acre and wait 170 years, and now it's worth $30,000 an acre. Pretty good profit margin, but long time to wait. We tend to just hang on to it and keep farming it. We're real stubborn. And money lending, they did that, and then they had a pharmacy business, which is, I think, cool because my wife is a pharmacist. Then Louis Huth brewed beer, and we sold Pearl beer at our saloon there in Rio Medina. Sorry, I'm hustling. And our family grew and prospered, and we're still there. Louis Huth was a founding member of the Lutheran Church. Dr. Boehm and Elizabeth, they were married there. And of the 12 founding members, Ludwig Mehring was a member of the Lutheran Church. That's his house there. That's our house. That's where we live. And then that little Casa Fuerte, you see the little gun port right there? That was Jules Simon Bourgeois' house. See, it's a teeny tiny affair, and it's got that little window to shoot that old rifle out of. Really, really cool. They use it as a smokehouse later. Here's a big collection of my Texas art. I was going to give a pitch to the Witty. If they ever have one of those Theodore Gentile's paintings that they want to get rid of, just call me. And then we own and operate a farm, and we farm some of Charles D. Montel's original plantation and all these old outlots here north of town. That's Charles D. Montel's house. It's in ruins, unfortunately. So, often the grandiose dreams and plans of some great enterprise get bloodied and beaten along their path to fruition. And Henri Castro and Louis Huth, they had big dreams, and it just didn't pan out like they wanted to. But everybody, keeps on pushing forward, and they do okay. We're still there, tilling the soil, feeding the cows. The Huth and the Castro name is no longer in Castroville, besides a few historical markers in their homestead. But we honor their sacrifices made, and I certainly honor my forebears' sacrifices made, and like to try to emulate them as best I can. Oh, I still had, sorry, you're really giving me the stink eye. So after I called Hector down there at the museum, he sent me this. This is Louis Huth Jr., but so this is actually Louis Joseph Huth is Louis Huth's son. And there's their hook and ladder company in front of the Alamo. That's a really cool picture, I think, like horse-drawn. Like we joke, my lieutenant, like, hey, what was it like when you had to hook up the horses to the... And then there's me and my little family and my firefighter outfit. Any questions? Or no? Yeah. Thank you. Thank you.
Trivia. What is the correct Alsatian pronunciation?
The Alsatian pronunciation of my name doesn't exist because it's a German name. Yeah. But Boehm is how we say it now. Boehme. You wouldn't, we actually talked about this, Gretchen and I, beforehand, how many times it gets goofed up, but it doesn't bother us one bit because I guess we're not really sure how you're supposed to say it. Somehow it became Boehm now, and over in Germany it was Bruma. It had an O umlaut, where the OE is, and in Alsace, Germany, that area. It's a little mix of everything, you know, so it doesn't really matter. Just don't call us late for supper kind of thing, you know.
And then in addition to the Hades, what about, how did all the shear hearts come?
Yeah, same thing. Sheer hearts are from Soplaho, and Henri Castro had sent representatives wherever there wasn't someone slandering his name or saying don't go to Texas. He sent somebody, and then a lot of folks. There was this like Frederick Ernst sort of scenario where someone wrote back and said, "Hey, it's awesome, come." And at some point in time, well, not some point in time, but Nick Habe, he was an Indian fighter and a farmer, rancher. He went back to Europe and got his father and mother and his younger siblings. And while he was there, he was like, oh, it's awesome, you know. And so a lot of folks came from his village. It's Oberentz in Alsace, south of Colmar. But yeah, the Shearheart, all those names that you're familiar with, those are the folks that I say came off the boat, didn't know nothing about Texas, and all of a sudden they're out there doing it, you know, horseback and Winchester in hand and all that. It's really cool. Yeah, thank you. Yes, ma'am. They came into Galveston, yeah, definitely. That was the main port. And then as time went along, they tried to come in through Corpus Christi. And then, of course, the Von Somm's crew came in through Indianola. And then a lot of our folks, like I have a receipt. It was in this old tobacco tin in my grandma and grandpa Habe's house. And it was from 1844 when they first got here. And it's in French, but it's steamship passage aboard the Rosaire ship. And it was from Galveston to Indianola. And that was, I have it framed in my little office, and you know, it's the first funds that the family put towards their new life in Texas, kind of thing. My nostalgic mind works like that. But it was closer to walk from Indianola than it was from Galveston, like I mentioned earlier. That's why they did that. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. Sure. Yeah. Someone else have their hand up? No? Good.
Oh, I was going to ask a question.
Oh, yeah.
Do you know, I don't know if you do, but my understanding is the Huths were Catholic, so I'm wondering when the change happened.
I can answer that question for you.
Okay.
I bet you Ludwig Huth was German, though he could have been Catholic already since his mama was Alsatian,
Sure.
but he married an Alsatian gal,
Okay.
and so that's most likely the scenario. See, that's where I would interpret history. I'd say, based on what I know from other stuff, I'd say he maybe was Lutheran at one time, and they converted to Catholicism from the French girls.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thanks. Thank y'all.
Does anybody have any questions for Mr. Galan? Oh, I was going to ask you a question. I was just curious, what was the motivation for, like, Angelique and all of the other caddos that were living there to help the Spanish and the French that were coming over? They seem so generous, and I just...
Yeah, and it should be also a caveat, too, because I think the X factor is the presence of the French in Louisiana, because it's quite possible that without that French presence, you know, something could have occurred again in which the caddos could have, you know, rose in rebellion or so. And that was one of the things that was actually mentioned when one of the missionaries in the late 1720s had requested from the viceroy permission to allow soldiers to forcibly recruit caddos into the missions, and the viceroy was concerned that no, can't do that, because if you allow military force to be used to gather them into the missions, they could rise in rebellion with the French that are nearby. And so, you know, that's like a stark contrast to, say, the missions here in San Antonio, for example. But it just seems to be part of the caddos' long history throughout the centuries of being able to deal with so many different peoples, which is really fascinating where they're positioned there in East Texas, and really what is the Four Corners region of Arkansas, Louisiana, Texas, and Oklahoma. Oh, yeah.
And so I was wondering, I know you mentioned that in the American history, women are sort of lost in the stories because it's mostly men that are doing the recording. But when you mentioned that women were so prominent
That I don't know the answer to right off. I was really interested in looking at Pete Gregory's work, who did the archaeology at the site of Los Adayas, to try to get into more of that oral history, oral tradition. Historian Juliana Barr does mention some of that in her work. Peace came in the form of a woman, Spanish and Indian relations in the Texas borderlands. And also specifically to see, because of the fact that the Tejas Caddo with the Nadarko, who became the Anadarko, end up in Oklahoma. And so I'm really interested to see if there's any remnants of people who would trace back to those Tejas in East Texas and ask those kind of questions, actually. So good question, though.
The Huth Coast Foundation has helped us with our museum there in Castroville. Our Living History Center, they have grants that they give, and actually Phil's wife, Mary, she's really good at writing those grants and looking for that funding. And then they call me and they say, hey, come and do some of that history stuff. So we're very appreciative of that kind of efforts of different funds and groups, you know, because Phil and I, we built the log cabin with our bare hands from scratch. That's how we try to save money. You know, we had an old log cabin there, double pin, and it was built somewhere and it was moved into the site where it's at now because it has notches in it, you know, that don't match up to the notches so we got an estimate for $110,000 to restore it from a group in Fredericksburg, and then Phil's like, we can build that. He gives me that elbow, you know. I'm like, yeah, sure, in our spare time we'll do it. Well, yeah, so last year, January and February, we did. We literally tore it down to the ground and rebuilt it back up from the ground up, and it's beautiful. It's really cool. It turned out great. And we got the beams, they're cypress. We got them from Louisiana and put it all back together, but that's our version of saving money, and then other versions like the Huth Coats giving us some funds and the Texas Historical Commission giving us some funds and stuff. We like to stretch those as far as we can, you know. Alsatians are funny like that. You give them a penny and they can stretch you out a whole roll of copper wire. Does that answer your question, Phil?
I was just going to mention Elizabeth Huth Coates is my great-grandmother, and so she's a descendant of Lewis Huth. And so I think that's the connection. Yep.